Today with Claire Byrne on RTE Radio 1.
Obviously, the travel industry is struggling to adapt to a COVID world. One sector hit harder than most is the cruise market. We all remember those images from last year. Cruise ships refused permission to berth in ports and sick passengers stranded on the ships as COVID-19 infections soared. So as we head towards summer, is there any chance that the cruise industry will get back on track? I'm joined now by travel expert Eoghan Corry from Air and Travel magazine. Good morning, Eoghan. How big is the cruise market in Ireland?
Not enormous in terms of numbers. It does about 33,000 people a year. That would make it smaller, for instance, than the ski sector. It's of huge importance because of the revenue it generates. It generates proportionately more. And as travel agents were sort of forced off the traditional point-to-point sales by airlines and even the package market, that's where they have been, bringing their expertise. So while it's not large in numbers, there's also a factor here that people who cruise tend not to do other types of holidays. And as you said, the cruise industry very, very badly hit by COVID from the very outset last March.
And how popular do they look now?
They are really in a crux. So they have been tied up. The ships have been, sort of refurbished or put into dock, and the staff, which are a big international staff, cruise ships would have people from all over the world, but the vast majority of them come from the Philippines, and they tend not to have very high earnings. They tend to depend very much on tips, and it's been devastating for the people employed by the cruise industry. The cruise industry itself is very profitable. It's dominated by two major players, and they've returned huge profits. I mean, they launched these ships that cost about €1.5 billion, and they launch 4 or 5 of these a year with great ceremonies and great aplomb, everything over the top, as is the industry itself. So not a great deal of sympathy for the actual shareholders and the people at the top, but certainly employment within the cruise industry has been devastated, and it relies unduly heavily on the United States.
There are then cruise companies that are operating currently, Eoghan.
Yeah, indeed. The big cash flow within cruise is completely dependent on the United States. It's not. It's very disproportionate, the amount of revenue generated, and everybody else is a long way behind. The UK and Germany would be the ones a long way behind. So what you're saying, people who are operating, and they did operate last summer, mainly in European context out of Italy, MSC and Costa would be two of the big Italians. But because of restrictions on international travel, Philip, it meant that only Italian citizens could get on board. For Hapag-Lloyd, only German citizens can get on board. And that's what appears to be happening this summer. Maybe 4 or 5 companies did it last year. I counted about 30 companies doing something similar this year. And they are doing cruises which are confined to one country.
But a passport is not a protection, Eoghan. What other measures are they putting in place where you have ultimately hundreds, maybe thousands of people in very, very enclosed spaces?
And you're absolutely right. I mean, the images from the Diamond Princess, what happened with one of the ships last year that wasn't allowed to dock, floated around for 4 or 5 weeks because ports wouldn't accept it. All of that was what really rocked the entire industry. Now, you've got to remember one thing here. They have to deal with viruses all the time. It's not COVID, obviously. It's norovirus, which has been the one that's been stalking the cruise industry. So they have very strict health measures with testing. It would have depended very heavily on temperature tests, which as we all know, some people thought might be a good way of detecting COVID. It didn't really prove as robust as people wanted. And that's what they were doing early on in the game. But now almost all of them have said you're not getting on board unless you're vaccinated. There's a couple of reasons for that. They have to protect the safety of their passengers. They also have to protect the safety of their staff, their crew, and the huge numbers of service personnel. And just to give you an idea of the scale of this, the larger of the ships will have 5,400 passengers and 2,500 crew. So you've effectively a metropolis the size of the town of New Ross, for instance, floating around the Caribbean. So keeping all of those people safe, it's a big challenge, even by the challenges that COVID throws up in other sectors. And one by one, they've all said, you're not getting on board unless you're vaccinated. They don't have the same human rights or concerns that, for instance, aviation has in implementing something like that. But it still has not been enough to get America unlocked. The American CDC has a plan that they announced last November of phases that the cruise industry must go through, and they were hoping to get through 3 or 4 of those 5 phases before July. Okay. But last Friday they got bad news. They're not even going to be allowed to do test cruises. And they're doing things like basing the American ships in the Caribbean. Even Iceland has a cruise around Iceland, which Americans are allowed to, will be hoping to board. But everyone has to be vaccinated before you get on board.
And are American cruisers then sticking to American ports, or are they sailing internationally? I mean, is there any chance that a cruise is going to turn up in Cork or Dublin this year?
It's a very interesting question because they're not allowed to board in America. What Iceland has done is you fly into Iceland and you get on board and you sail around Iceland. But the Caribbean countries depend very heavily on cruising, so a lot of cruise companies are basing their ships there. The numbers that they're talking about is a trickle. Americans are allowed to fly to Caribbean countries, but they're not allowed to fly to Ireland. The UK cruise, some of the American cruise companies and some of the Europeans are doing around the UK, boarding only UK guests. But certainly, there's no opportunity to board Americans on a cruise ship in Ireland unless we change our regulations. And there's already a problem, completely unrelated to COVID, that Dublin, which is the one which is near the international airport, Cork is a deeper harbour, but its airport doesn't have transatlantic connections. Dublin already has told cruise ships, we can't handle you because of the huge pressure that's put on the port by Brexit.
Right. If you had to look into your crystal ball, Eoghan, do you think that this industry will still be here with us in the same way, at the same size, catering for the same volume of people 2-3 years from now?
Absolutely. It was not clear until the early months, but it became very apparent that cruise people don't like doing other types of holidays. There's a load of advantages of cruise. The main one being that you unpack once and you're in one room and you see city after city across the Mediterranean. The second one is the actual cost per day when you factor in the food and everything like that is cheaper than a land-based holiday. What the real problem the cruise industry is going to come back and haunt it is it's going to be impossible. I was going to say very difficult, but it's going to be impossible to get new to cruise people, which it needs. To persuade people that going into a big stadium environment on a large cruise ship is a safe way of resuming travel after COVID. That's what's going to take 3 or 4 years. But the hardy, sturdy cruise market, they're going to stick with what they do. And in Irish terms, the smaller cruise ships, the ones that very high-end luxury stuff that the likes of Crystal or Azamara do, they can get into ports like Killybegs, like Foynes. They can get into the west of Ireland ports, and there is probably an opportunity for that. But in terms of as tourism opens up, it's not going to be the big cruise ships that do it. It's going to be wind through your hair, west of Ireland, outdoor, cycling, walking, all of those things that Ireland do best, that we're going to be first to throw into the market when we get the opportunity to do so.
Eoghan Corry from Air and Travel magazine, thank you very much for that. Now, we have an update in from the teachers' conferences. The TUI, ASTI and INTO have all voted in favour of the motion to hold a ballot on strike action unless the government agrees to reverse its decision to move the vaccine rollout to an age-based system, back to one, obviously, that would prioritise teachers. So that's all 3 main teachers' unions voting in favour of a motion that they will ballot on strike action if they don't get a reversal from the government on that decision to move to an age-based system. Coming up after the break, Kathleen Murray is here to answer all of your dog questions. 51551 If you want to text her, todaycb@rte.ie if you want to get it into us on by email.
Text 51551 today with Claire Byrne on RTE Radio 1.